This is an intro to chemistry, section 1.3, scientific methods. Some of the objectives that we're going to cover is identify the common steps of scientific methods, compare and contrast types of data, identify types of variables, and describe the difference between a theory and a scientific law. Some vocabulary you might want to review is systematic approach. And some new vocabulary is scientific method, qualitative data, quantitative data, hypothesis, experiment, independent variable, dependent variable, control, conclusion, theory, and scientific law. You might have worked with a group on an experiment in the laboratory in a previous science course. And if you have, you probably have come across that your different group members have different ideas about how to do the lab. Having different ideas about how to do the lab is one benefit of people coming together to work on a common goal. However, communicating ideas effectively to one another and combining individual contributions to form a solution can be difficult in group work. Scientists approach their work in a similar way. Each scientist tries to understand his or her world based on personal point of view and individual creativity. Often the work of scientists is combined in order to gain new insight. It is helpful for scientists if all scientists use common procedures, they conduct their experiment. Right? This common procedure we call the scientific method, which is a systematic approach used in scientific study, whether it's going to be chemistry, biology, physics, or any other science. We can go ahead and use the scientific method in pretty much anything that we used. The scientific method is more or less an organized process used by scientists to do research, and it provides a method for scientists to verify the work of others. An overview of typical steps of a scientific method we'll talk about in a little bit. You have to keep in mind that this is not a checklist of things to do. The scientific method needs to be done in the same order each time. Therefore, scientists must describe their methods when they report their results. If other scientists cannot confirm their results, doubt arises, as well as doubt in the validity of their results. Right. The scientific method begins with an observation, whether it's something that's existing knowledge, some sort of qualitative data, right, how something might look, or quantitative data, how much of something exists. Once we've made our observations, we can go ahead and form a hypothesis, which is a testable testable statement or a prediction. We then go ahead and take our hypothesis and run an experiment. And from those experiments, we can go ahead and base conclusions. And if our conclusion doesn't fit or seems askew, we have to go ahead and revise our hypothesis, in which we go ahead and create a new experiment to go ahead and create a new conclusion. We can go ahead and take overwhelming amount of conclusions and create theories, in which a theory is a hypothesis supported by many experiments. And we can go ahead and also create a scientific law, which is a summary of accepted facts in nature. Right, to talk about observations, you make observations throughout your day in order to make decisions. Scientific study usually begins with a simple observation, right? Just simply gathering information. Often the types of observations scientists make are going to be qualitative data, right? Information that describes color, odor, shape, or some sort of physical characteristic that we can observe. Anything that relates to the five senses, right, usually gets clumped into qualitative data. Scientists also use a different type of data, right? If you can go ahead and measure something like temperature, pressure, volume, or the quantity of something, right, we're usually talking about quantitative data, right? Numerical information is quantitative data. It tells us how much or how little how big, how tall, how fast, right, something could be. A hypothesis is a tentative explanation for what has been observed. Right? If we kind of go back to section 1.1, right, scientists Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland were curious about how long CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, could exist in the atmosphere. Right? They examined interactions that occur amongst various chemicals in the troposphere, and they determined that CFCs were stable there for long periods of time. But they also knew that CFCs drift upward into the stratosphere. They formed the hypothesis that CFCs break down in the stratosphere due to the interactions with ultraviolet light from the sun. In addition, the calculations they made led to the hypothesis that chlorine produced by this interaction would break down the ozone. An experiment is meaningless unless there is data to support it. Thus, forming a hypothesis helps the scientists focus on next step in a scientific method, which is the experiment. An experiment is a set of controlled observations that test the hypothesis. Scientists must carefully plan and set up one or more laboratory experiments in order to change and test one variable at a time. A variable is a quantity or condition that can have more than one value. Suppose we were going to go ahead and do an experiment to test the hypothesis of table salt dissolving faster in hot water than in water at room temperature. Because the temperature is the variable that you plan to change, temperature is therefore what we call the independent variable. Your group determines that a given quantity of salt completely dissolves within 1 minute at 40 degrees Celsius, but the same quantity of salt dissolves after 3 minutes at 20 degrees Celsius. Therefore, the temperature affects the rate at which the salt dissolves. The rate at which salt dissolves is known as the dependent variable because its value changes in response to a change in the independent variable. Although your group can determine the way in which the independent variable changes, it has no control the way the dependent variable changes. Other factors you might want to go ahead and consider in your experiment, right? Especially with the one with the salt dissolving in different temperatures, right, is the amount of salt you try to go ahead and dissolve. What is the amount of water that you're using? Would stirring the mixture affect your results? The answer to all these questions might be yes. You must plan your experiment so that these variables are the same at each temperature, or you will not be able to tell clearly what caused your results. In a well-planned experiment, the independent variable should be the only condition that affects the experiment's outcome. A constant is a factor that is not allowed to change during the experiment. The amount of salt, the amount of water, and the rate of stirring must be constant at each temperature. In many experiments, it's valuable to have a control. That is a standard for comparison. In the above experiment, the room temperature water is the control. Chemical in the experiment below, a chemical indicator has been added to each of the 3 test tubes. An acidic solution is in the test tube on the left, and the indicator turns red. The test tube in the middle contains water, and the indicator is yellow. The test tube on the right contains a basic solution, and the indicator turns blue. Because of the acidity of the solutions in the test tube is known, these solutions can be used as controls in an experiment. The interactions described between the CFCs and ozone in Molina and Rowland's hypothesis take place high overhead. Many variables are involved. For example, there are several gases that are present in the stratosphere. Thus, it would be difficult to determine which gases, or if all gases, are causing a decreasing ozone levels. Winds, variations in ultralight, and other factors could change the outcome of any experiment on any given day, making comparisons difficult. Sometimes it's easier to simulate conditions in a laboratory where the variables can be more easily controlled. An experiment might generate a large amount of data. Scientists take the data, analyze it, and check it against the hypothesis to form a conclusion. A conclusion is a judgment based on the information obtained. A hypothesis can never be proven. Therefore, when the data supports a hypothesis, this only indicates that the hypothesis might be true. If further evidence does not support it, then the hypothesis must be discarded or modified. The majority of hypotheses are not supported, but the data might still yield new and useful information. Molina and Rowland formed a hypothesis about the stability of CFCs in the stratosphere. They gathered data that supported their hypotheses and developed a model in which the chlorine formed from the breakdown of CFCs would react over and over again with ozone. A model can be tested and used to make predictions. Molina and Rowland's model predicted the formation of chlorine and depletion of ozone. Another research group found evidence of interactions between ozone and chlorine when taking measurements in the stratosphere, but they did not know the source of the chlorine. Molina and Rowland's model predicted a source of the chlorine. They came to the conclusion that ozone in the stratosphere could be destroyed by CFCs, and they had enough to support for their hypothesis to publish their discovery. In 1995, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. A theory is an explanation of natural phenomena based on many observations and investigations over time. You might have heard of Einstein's theory of relativity or the atomic theory. A theory states a broad principle of nature that has been supported over time. All theories are still subject to new experimental data and can be modified. Also, theories often lead to new conclusions. A theory is considered successful if it can be used to make predictions that are true. Sometimes many scientists come to the same conclusions about certain relationships in nature, and they find no exceptions to these relationships. For example, you know that no matter how many times skydivers leap from a plane, they always return to the Earth's surface. Sir Isaac Newton was so certain that an attraction force exists between all objects that he proposed his law of universal gravitation. Newton's law is a scientific law. A scientific law is a relationship in nature that is supported by many experiments. It is up to scientists to develop a further hypothesis and experiments to explain why these relationships exist. A section summary of 1.3 is that 1. Scientific methods are a systematic approach to problem solving. Qualitative data describes an observation. Quantitative data uses numbers. Independent variables are changed in an experiment. Dependent variables change in response to the independent variable. And a theory is a hypothesis that is supported by many experiments.